Hello, I'm your host, Brian Callanan. After a challenging budget process, what is the City Council investing in homelessness, public safety, and affordable housing? And why are there lingering questions about funding for the Seattle Police Department? Plus, how will a new investment in transportation help with road safety for cyclists and pedestrians? Councilmember Andrew Lewis answers these questions and the ones you're sending in too, next on Council Edition.
There's been a lot of discussion about this in the media that's frankly been inaccurate. I think Chief Diaz needs to apologize to the public and clarify his statements.
All that and more coming up next on City Inside Out, Council Edition. And joining me for this month's program, we have with us Councilmember Andrew Lewis. He is representing District 7 from downtown Magnolia, also chair of the Council's Committee on Homelessness. Councilmember Lewis, I invited a number of your colleagues here. I'm sorry the scheduling didn't work out to have them join us, but I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk about the budget process.
Great to be here, Brian.
Great. Well, let's move right to it. A lot to unpack here with the $7.1 billion budget the council just approved. I want to start with an investment in affordable housing that Budget Chair Councilmember Mosqueda called historic. Nearly $200 million going towards this, with $165 million going towards creating new affordable rental housing, which she says is twice the amount invested in previous years. I want to talk about what impact this is going to have and how soon might we see this housing actually come online.
Well, Brian, I think this is really a historic investment. As Councilmember Mosqueda said, this is really true, and we're taking advantage of some very unique circumstances right now. There's been historic investment from the state in the State Housing Trust Fund, historic investment from the federal government through the COVID relief packages, and then some innovative thinking on behalf of Emily Alvarado, our former Director of Housing, and front-loading a bunch of resources from the housing levy. We've been able to put all of this together to realize some really monumental advances in housing acquisition. And, I put out a report in October on how this is going to affect permanent supportive housing. It was part of this report generally on homelessness during COVID. We've seen a 47% increase over the last couple of years in the acquisition of permanent supportive housing. We're going to keep building on that work with this money. And I think what you're really seeing is the council leverage our resources to leverage resources from state and federal partners to amplify the impact. And you're right, that is like one of the single biggest takeaways from this budget is really a revolutionary increase in these housing resources.
And can you touch on quick, when would we see this come online? Because I know that's always part of the issue here. These things don't get built overnight. When might we see actually some of these buildings ready to go?
Well, we're going to have about 800 or so units come online in the first quarter of 2022. And I first sort of reported back on that in that report from October where we put that in terms of what the timeline would be. It's hard to say for some of this that we funded right now in this budget, because some of it's going to be new build. And, for that to be in effect, we have to build it. And that's going to take a while. Some of it's going to be acquiring hotels and motels, or it's going to be acquiring new build. And we've had quite a couple good examples of that over the summer. We purchased 3 buildings that were essentially commercial apartment buildings that were just coming online, and a private developer sold them to us instead of opening and doing the private market. So it's going to depend on what it is. So some of it could be sometime in 2022. Some of it might be further out. But I do want to, again, just emphasize some of what we've acquired and funded through leveraging a lot of this federal support in 2021 is going to come online in the first quarter of 2022. And some of it, Brian, is already open. Too. So, not a whole lot of it, but some of it. So it's good. We're finally, this council was elected in 2019 to deliver on housing, and we really are delivering on housing.
Great. I want to transition to the budget for homelessness, and I'll harken back to this study that your office did in October that talked about our city gets 2.5 times more requests for shelter than there are spaces available. And I'm looking at the budget for 2022 that you just approved. You're setting aside $10 million for tiny house villages, $1.5 million towards safe car parking for homeless people. And I should say, Seattle does have some shelter beds that will be coming online at the end of this year, as you know, from that last budget period. I'm just trying to look ahead, though. Do you think the city made a big enough investment in the 2022 budget in shelter space?
Well, we're going to have a transition in executive leadership, and
Right.
I'm really proud to be serving on Mayor-elect Harrell's public safety transition team, and this is certainly something we've been talking about. I mean, in the context of homelessness, but there is some overlap with our public safety discussions.
Right.
I think that one of the big bottlenecks we need to be mindful of is it's not just about building things; it's also about securing the services of staff, some of those entities. And what we're really doing here in this budget is, in addition to getting some new shelter assets online, we are enhancing some of our existing assets so we can get some pass through from that shelter into permanent housing, be it permanent supportive housing or be it a market rate placement. So I think what you're really seeing in this budget is not just an increase in some important assets, but making sure that when someone has a significant public health challenge like behavioral mental health or substance addiction, that some of our shelter assets like a tiny house village are equipped to provide the care and service for that at a higher acuity than they currently do. And then for folks that are still falling through the cracks, we're jointly funding with King County a high acuity behavioral mental health shelter. It's going to help folks that have some of the most severe barriers to success that currently we don't have a good sheltering asset to help them with.
Can I jump in on that one, Councilmember Lewis? Because we're talking about the King County RHA, the Regional Homelessness Authority. It's coming online in January, and it had made this request for this high acuity shelter space, meaning helping people with severe behavioral health or addiction problems. I know the council put some money towards this, about $5 million, but not all the money the RHA was looking for. And following up on that, the Seattle Metro Chamber had a reaction. Not investing in the entirety of the authority's request doesn't get us where we need to be. If we're not doing everything we can to set up the authority to urgently take action, we're just delaying seeing the outcomes that we want to see. I want to ask how you respond to that, and just tell me what the council is trying to do with this $5 million investment.
Well, in principle, I agree with that statement from the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, I brought forward the amendment to fully fund that shelter asset at $19 million, and that was not fully adopted into the budget. But I do want to say that some of it is paying for what we absolutely have to pay for right now, and then building over the course of 2022 to realize the entire capability of that shelter. I mean, put another way,
other funding partners to be involved too.
Put it another way, Brian, right? Like before we can staff it, we need to build it.
Okay.
And that's so what we did is looking at our tight budget situation where the forecast came in differently than what the mayor's budget had been built for. We had to look at, okay, well, what do we have to do right now? Like what money do we have to get to the authority in the first half of 2022 so they can start this critical work?
Right.
And, they're going to have to build this high acuity shelter. It potentially is going to take until the summer of 2022. Over that time, we'll be able to work with King County and look at how revenue is recovering, particularly if there's a significant coming back to work downtown and there's higher than anticipated revenue recovery. This will be hopefully a prime candidate for some of those new resources so that we can have the resources for the services at the site by the time it comes online. So I think that we have a roadmap to get to the full investment to realize this. And I think that this exercise, as Councilmember Mosqueda had indicated, is really, what do we have to pay for right now to get this moving? And this council budget does that.
Yeah, great point. Thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to make sure you answered a question that came in from one of our viewers specifically about shelter. Eric writes this: Port Townsend relocates everyone experiencing homelessness to the fairgrounds, which is a location where services can be provided. It's humane and it saves public spaces from becoming, I should say, trashed and unsafe. Why isn't Seattle following a model like this? Eric, thank you for sending in that email. And Councilmember Lewis, Jefferson County has indeed used the fairgrounds to shelter homeless people during the governor's eviction moratorium. Is something like this, that larger shelter type of area, an option for Seattle?
Preaching to the choir.
Okay, here we go.
I'll just say that, this council funded in the 2021 budget upwards of 1,650 shelter units. We've not been able to see that entire number of units implemented by the executive. If you go down to San Francisco, Brian, I've been down there twice during the pandemic. They have a sanctioned camping program that basically allows, they set up camps in places like this fairgrounds that's being referred to, places like
Yeah.
parking lots or areas where camping would be more desirable,
Yeah.
with hygiene facilities, with case management.
Hmm.
And then as a result, they don't have anyone camping in their parks in
Yeah.
the core of the city. So
Yeah.
there's ways to have these mitigation strategies. There's definitely resources available. We just need to make sure we come together with Mayor-elect Harrell to
Yeah.
implement an approach like that. But that has consistently been what this council has wanted to see.
Yeah.
It has not always been something that we've been able to get accordance with the executive on.
Yeah, and let me talk a little bit more about Mayor-elect Harrell, because I talked to him several weeks ago on the campaign trail with regard to homelessness spending in particular. He was talking about funding for homelessness doesn't need to be increased, and here's what he said.
I believe we have enough resources. So you'll see other people saying, well, we can't do this because we don't have enough funding. We have an abundance of resources in this city and in this region that we will put to work.
Councilmember Lewis, I've touched on this issue with you before, but I wanted to try to figure out how a new administration in Mayor-elect Harrell, who is saying we have enough resources and also we're going to clear public spaces of encampments, how is that going to mesh with city council priorities?
Well, I think it's really important to separate solving the problem of homelessness from mitigating the problem of homelessness. And I think this is a conversation we need to have, and it gets muddled because some people confuse the two things. Solving the problem of homelessness is going to cost billions of dollars. It's going to require a scaling of permanent supportive housing. It's going to require a fundamental, reevaluation of our public health, mental health, substance addiction systems. But mitigating homelessness by using strategies like what we were just referring to, by having an increased access to enhanced sheltering resources, having a system potentially of sanctioned encampments, kind of harkening back to tent city types of situations. Those are things that can be done within existing resources. It is possible within existing resources to give people a place that they can be, that has support, that has hygiene facilities, and have that place not be a park. And this is what the council's policy has been. This is why we sent a budget forward funding 1,650 shelter spaces in 2021. Because we want to provide, at the very least, temporary places that people can be so they don't have to be in parks. And that has consistently been the council's policy. That hasn't always been made clear. It's also been obfuscated by opponents of the council many times. But the council emphatically does not want people to be living in parks. Parks are not for shelter. Parks are for recreation and for other purposes. And you know who agrees with that? The people currently living in the parks, because we're not giving them an alternative place they can be. So it's pretty simple. Other cities have shown the way that you can invest in mitigation strategies that give us room and space to build toward the permanent supportive housing goals that the Third Coalition has outlined. But we need to be really, really clear-eyed about having those two strategies. It's, we need to mitigate first, and then we can work on solving the big underlying problem.
Thank you very much for that. I want to talk about another question with regard to the council working with some new people in city government. Our new city attorney, Ann Davison, the city attorney-elect there, she's talking about making sure misdemeanor crimes are prosecuted. Here's what she said to me a few weeks ago on the campaign trail.
The role of our city attorney is to make sure that we are dealing with what our societal limits are to protect them. So the prosecution has to be there.
Councilmember Lewis, I bring this up because the council really did make a point in this budget to invest in pre-filing diversion programs, also making sure LEAD, law enforcement assisted diversion, gets more funding to expand too. How is this emphasis from the council going to connect with what our new city attorney says she is trying to do when it comes to prosecutions?
Well, as someone who used to be an assistant city attorney, I'm incredibly proud of the work that we've been able to do with Choose 180 and community passageways on having robust pre-file diversion options. These are programs that have a recidivism rate of around 10%, incredibly low. They connect people with resources, they give them hope, they give them opportunity. They empower them, as Choose 180 implies, to make better choices. And that's really what restorative justice is. It's about making victims whole and empowering people to make better choices and change their circumstances. So going forward, I would hope that we continue to emphasize these programs that have incredibly low criminal recidivism, that are cheaper than traditional criminal justice interventions like incarceration or probationary surveillance. And look, I think we need to really center that there are certainly roles when you're dealing with people who are committing violent crime or people who are doing DUIs. We certainly need to have all the options on the table, including potentially jail time. But there's an overwhelmingly large number of cases that go through the court where these diversion services are more appropriate. One last thing that I would just share here too is I do think people are going to start getting kind of clear-eyed on some of the rhetoric they maybe used during the campaign when they face the reality of governing, which, as I can tell you, is a harder task. But you know, city attorney's office receives about 14,000 referrals a year. There's about 4 trial courts in the municipal court. In a good week, you can maybe do 4 jury trials, maybe do about 200 trials a year, 14,000 referrals, and those referrals don't stop. So we need to be innovative in how we're churning through that and providing justice and security to the people of Seattle. And you aren't going to be able to do it just by prosecuting your way out of it. There aren't the resources, there aren't the courtrooms, and it's something where you know, when reality sets in, we're going to have a policy conversation about how to achieve those goals.
Got it. Thanks for breaking that down. I want to touch on one more issue of homelessness before we move on to other priorities of the council here. The city just approved a deal with King County for a land swap so that the county is now going to own City Hall Park just south of the courthouse there, and the city has picked up some property in the South Park area. I know, and you know, that City Hall Park had a large encampment in it, some associated public safety concerns there. It's now closed to the public as the county takes over. 2 pieces here, if you would. What's going to be different about the county's approach to encampments in this space, do you think, if they do appear again there? And is this a model that could be replicated on other properties in Seattle? Some thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think what's more important than who owns the park is what are we doing there, right? And I think this has been the fundamental question, is we want to make sure that we have these parks that are the centerpieces of our civic spaces to be activated areas of recreation, of gathering, and of community wellness. And certainly City Hall Park has not been that for most of 2021 and is an integral centerpiece of the county campus. In terms of I don't really know that there's much precedential value in this land swap. I can't think of other public spaces where that are that intimately associated with another government within the city of Seattle. And as you're well aware, Brian, that park is like joined at the hip.
That's right.
To the courthouse and various other county office buildings that are nearby in the center of the county campus. You know, I'm going to want to hear from the neighborhood in Pioneer Square. I'm going to want to hear from the Pioneer Square Alliance. I'm going to want to hear from the Pioneer Residents Council, who have been engaged in a lot of visioning on that space pre-COVID, and a lot of the plans got kind of derailed because of the intervention of COVID. And just make sure that we're still going forward with a vision that is centering the community, regardless of who owns that parcel, because that's what's more important. If we can realize that with the city retaining ownership, I'm all for it. If we can realize that by implementing a county vision, I'm all ears to hear what it is.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on to what has been a challenging discussion about funding for the Seattle Police Department for the council here. Council President Lorena Gonzalez brought up an amendment that tried to eliminate not current officer jobs, but rather the spending authority for 101 positions that the SPD says it does not expect to fill in 2022. Now, Interim Chief Adrian Diaz was not happy about that. Here's what he said in a statement released just before the council's vote.
The council president's amendment would permanently eliminate another 101 police officers. This would greatly jeopardize the safety of our communities and have long-term impacts on investigating violent crimes and caring for our most vulnerable.
So, Councilmember Lewis, the chief's statement seemed to indicate the council wanted to cut current positions. In fact, it did not propose doing that, and it is fully funding the SPD's hiring plan for 125 officers in 2022. I want to get into this because the SPD is unique. It asked the council to leave room in its budget for dozens of positions that it likely won't fill, and then it redirects that money to other places in the department. I know this was a very close decision for the council, and you voted against the council president's amendment. I want you to tell me why, and also tell us what sort of message you're trying to put across about police funding in this budget.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I mean, look, I think on both sides, this conversation has been a little bit of a distraction. I appreciate the arguments that Councilmember Gonzalez brought forward, Council President Gonzalez brought forward to do the abrogation. I ultimately voted against it because it didn't stop the council from reapportioning the money that was built into the budget to fund those positions. It's not like we have kept all of that money in the department to fund sort of these vacant FTEs that we have no expectation of filling, and SPD can now spend that on whatever they want to.
Okay.
We kept the position authority in place by rejecting the abrogation bill. But
Okay.
Councilmember Mosqueda moved that money around. There's no
Yeah.
money that's just kind of sitting behind an empty position
Okay.
and not getting out into the community.
Okay.
Given that reality that we can just move it around, I didn't see any issue with giving some flexibility to Mayor-elect Harrell by keeping that position authority in there and then having this discussion anew in 2022.
Okay.
I do want to take a moment just more broadly to say that there were some real amendments that could have made a difference. I brought one forward to change the attritional expectations in departmental resignations of sworn officers. I wish the chief would have spent more attention on that. There's been a lot of discussion about this in the media that's frankly been inaccurate. I think Chief Diaz needs to apologize to the public and clarify his statements. I think that it's not a good step in general counsel relations, even if some of us ultimately voted the way he wanted to do. I voted in spite of, not because of his statement. If anything, his statement made me potentially want to change my vote to vote with Councilmember Gonzalez.
Yeah.
But I do think that going forward, especially if Chief Diaz is looking to potentially come before the council for a confirmation vote to be the permanent chief, and I don't know what Mayor-elect Harrell's plans are going to be, he's going to need to shape up and have a more collegial approach to dealing with the council that includes not deliberately misleading the public on actions that are in front of us.
Thank you for doing that. Does the SPD need a new budgeting process? That feels like a key issue here.
I think that it would be advisable for Mayor-elect Harrell, and I am on his public safety transition team.
Yeah.
I think it would be advisable as we're looking towards building a public safety budget for 2022 to not engage in the same practice of funding unfillable positions, which the outgoing administration did, which necessitated the council moving the money around.
Right.
But again, we were able to move it around. But I think that it would probably be a step in the right direction if we engaged in a process where instead some of that money was proactively taken and built into other priorities and other initiatives.
Okay.
And specifically, Mayor-elect Harrell advocated extensively on the campaign trail for something near and dear to my heart, which is adopting a Seattle version of Cahoots.
Yeah, right.
And that is a really, really valuable program. In Eugene, Oregon,
Happening in Eugene,
it takes almost 20% of 911 calls. And look, Brian, I'm just going to lay it out like this, just real succinctly. We funded that full hiring class. We funded a full hiring class for SPD officers in 2021 as well. But the reality is, if attrition stays high and we're just hiring to replace attrition, we're not going to get ahead of the issue we're having with 911 response times.
Yeah.
At this point, developing 911 response alternatives is necessary. It's not just a matter of policy preference. If we don't do it, we're not going to be able to adequately respond to calls for a city of our size. So, we need to really get serious about building those out in 2022. I look forward to working with Mayor-elect Harrell on realizing that vision, since it's a vision that the council and the mayor-elect share. This council has been very supportive of adopting a Cahoot-style alternative, but we really want to see how we can advance that in the next budget, which will be for 2023. And I think part of it would be let's not in the proposed budget fund the ghost positions. Let's move that money to some other alternatives that get out in the street and provide the relief to the people that need it.
Yep, a lot of changes coming with the 911 system. Thanks for breaking that down. We're getting close to the finish here, Councilmember Lewis, and I wanted to make sure I talked about other budget issues you've been working on, specifically a proposal to use an increase in the commercial parking tax to go towards making safety improvements for cyclists and pedestrians. Can you talk about this, please? I know this is something you championed.
Yeah, so it's been a decade since we've raised the commercial parking tax. For those who are unfamiliar, this is a tax that's assessed basically when you're paying to park in a private garage. So it's applied basically as part of that ticket. We can use it for transportation funding priorities. And, look, Brian, we've been talking a lot about the backlog that we have. I mean, once we get through the public safety and homelessness crises that we're facing right now as a city, transportation infrastructure is going to be coming right up on us. I mean, it's going to be one of the big issues in the next decade. And when I say that, I'm talking about, realizing our goals around Vision Zero. For those who are unfamiliar, it's our vision that by 2030, we will not have a single pedestrian or biker fatality related to a traffic accident. And we are so far from that goal. I mean, we've had dozens of our neighbors killed in traffic accidents in 2022, which is unacceptable. And we need to keep building toward developing the infrastructure to have protected bike lanes, to have better and more well-maintained sidewalks. At the same time, we've had audits indicating that we have a crumbling bridge infrastructure. And we have a lot of bridges with deferred and delayed maintenance, and bridges that are due for replacement, including some that are in poor condition, that are actually designated as poor condition. So all of these things are building up. This is an infusion of new resources to address both of these issues with some new resource and some new money to certainly get us through to the renewal of the transportation levy, which I hope is going to really lean into these issues, because it's coming down the pipeline. It's going to be a big challenge we need to deal with.
Got it. I got 45 seconds I can share here. Councilmember Lewis, any last thoughts about maybe some things that haven't hit a lot of headlines but are important to District 7 when it comes to budget ads?
Yeah, I was really happy to be able to work with a couple of neighborhood councils to deliver some, some small but incredibly meaningful community projects in this budget. As you may be aware from talking to Councilmember Bagshaw, we've got the Market to Mohai improvement project, which links Pike Place Market to the Museum of History and Industry in South Lake Union by making certain pedestrian and lighting improvements. We were able to get that project restored, funded in the budget. We were also able to get some temporary activations at the Battery Portal site in Belltown. This is where the viaduct used to be. This is a site that may ultimately become a school at some point in the future. But in the meantime, it's this big piece of empty open space in Belltown. And by putting some resources into that, we can use it as an amenity for the community in the meantime. So really excited about those.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Andrew Lewis joining us here on Council Edition. And we will see you next time on Council Edition. I'm Brian Callahan. Till then.